Chapter 1. The Woman in the Clinic. The air on Caldera Prime was thick with dust and the scent of overheated machinery, a constant reminder that this colony had been built on necessity rather than comfort. The capital city, Rust Haven, was a sprawling mess of prefab structures, worn-down markets, and repurposed starship hulls that had been turned into makeshift homes. It was not a place for the wealthy, nor was it a place where people could afford weakness. Here, survival was a daily struggle, and the only law that mattered was the one enforced by those who had the power to wield it. Dr. Ethan Voss had come here knowing what he was getting himself into. Unlike the polished, state-of-the-art hospitals in the core worlds, the Rust Haven medical outpost was barely holding itself together. The power flickered every other day. The water purification system only worked when someone remembered to kick it in frustration, and the only medical supplies available were what they could scavenge, barter, or steal. It was not ideal, but it was desperately needed. Ethan had seen more injuries than he cared to count: miners with radiation burns, mercenaries with plasma wounds, civilians who had gotten on the wrong side of a gang dispute. Most days, he worked until exhaustion took him, patching up people who had no one else to turn to. He didn't do it for the money. There was barely any money to be made here. He did it because someone had to. That was why, when a strange request came in late one evening, he didn't hesitate. A hooded figure, draped in worn-out desert garb, had entered the clinic just as he was finishing up with a patient. The way she moved, quick, deliberate, avoiding the gaze of others, immediately set off alarms in his head. This was not someone who wanted to be seen. She stepped closer, lowering her hood, and Ethan found himself staring into a pair of striking violet eyes, framed by midnight blue skin and delicate features that were unmistakably alien. She was Zelvari, a rare sight in these parts. The Zelvari were a reclusive, noble race, known for their advanced technology and their strict cultural hierarchies. They rarely mingled with humans, and even when they did, it was never in places like this. To see one here in Rust Haven was unusual enough. But what really caught his attention was the urgency in her expression. "Are you the human doctor?" Her voice was soft, but there was an edge of desperation in it. Ethan frowned, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Yeah, that's me. Who's asking?" She hesitated for only a moment before reaching into her cloak and pulling out a hollow slate, activating a small projection of a woman lying in a medical cot. Ethan immediately knew what he was looking at. The Zelvari woman in the projection had the same violet eyes, the same regal features, but her body was frail, thin, her legs motionless beneath the blankets. A paraplegic, and from the look of her condition, she had been that way for a while. "She needs help," the hooded Zelvari whispered, "and you are the only one who can provide it." Ethan exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "All right, tell me everything." A patient in the shadows. Ethan followed the Zelvari woman through the back alleys of Rust Haven, keeping his pace steady, his mind already working through the possibilities. Paraplegia wasn't uncommon in the Outer Rim, especially with the lack of proper medical care, but the Zelvari had some of the most advanced technology in the galaxy. So why hadn't they been able to help her? They arrived at a modest safe house, hidden between two abandoned storage units. The moment they stepped inside, Ethan felt the weight of secrecy in the air. This wasn't just a simple medical case. Inside, the woman from the projection lay on a cot, her face pale, her expression tense as she looked up at him. She was younger than he had expected, maybe only a few years older than the Zelvari who had brought him here. Her robes, though simple, carried the unmistakable embroidery of nobility, subtle, but undeniable. Ethan had seen enough Zelvari diplomats to recognize it. This was no ordinary patient. She studied him with sharp, assessing eyes, as if trying to determine whether he could be trusted. "You are the human doctor?" Ethan nodded, setting his bag down. "Ethan Voss, what happened to you?" A flicker of something frustration, maybe even shame crossed her face before she composed herself. "My injuries are permanent." He crouched beside her, already pulling out his scanner. "Let me be the judge of that." The moment he began his scan, he saw the real issue. Her spinal cord had not been severed, but rather damaged by some kind of energy discharge. The tissue had been scarred beyond normal repair, but if she had access to the right technology, she could have been healed long ago. And yet, she hadn't been. Ethan frowned. This could have been treated months ago if you had access to a proper medbay. She looked away. That was not an option. He glanced between her and the younger Zelvari woman who had brought him here, his mind putting the pieces together. They weren't just hiding. They were on the run, which meant whoever she was important. Ethan sighed, setting the scanner down. All right, tell me the real reason you need my help. There was a long pause. Then, finally, she spoke. My name is Zyra. Ethan waited, knowing there was more. She exhaled. And I am the daughter of Queen Tishara of the Zelvari Empire. The words hung in the air between them like a live plasma charge, humming with dangerous energy. Ethan blinked. Then he exhaled sharply. Of course you are. This wasn't just a noble. This was a princess. A paraplegic alien princess, on the run, seeking medical treatment from a human in the Outer Rim. What the hell had he just gotten himself into? The truth behind the escape. Zyra studied his expression, as if trying to gauge how much she could trust him. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. Let me get this straight. You're the daughter of the Zelvari Queen, but you're hiding out in the worst part of the galaxy, and you need me to fix something your people could have fixed months ago. That about right? Zyra's jaw tightened. My exile was involuntary. Ethan's eyebrows raised. You were exiled? The younger Zelvari woman, the one who had brought him here, finally spoke up. Not exactly. Zyra closed her eyes briefly before opening them again. I was taken by enemies of my mother. A political move. Ethan stiffened. You were kidnapped. A short nod. Ethan let out a low curse. The kidnapping of a royal heir wasn't just a crime. It was an act of war. And yet, no war had broken out, which meant someone was keeping it quiet. How did you escape? Zyra's expression darkened. That is not important. Ethan didn't believe that for a second, but what mattered right now was her health. She was alive. She was safe. And now, for better or worse, he was involved. Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. Well, princess, looks like I just became your doctor. Chapter 2. The Risk of Saving a Princess. The weight of Zyra's words settled over the room like a storm cloud, dark and foreboding. Ethan had treated runaways, criminals, and fugitives before people who had crossed the wrong warlord, stolen from the wrong syndicate, or simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but never had he found himself staring into the eyes of an exiled alien princess, injured, vulnerable, and wrapped in layers of political danger. The Zelvari Empire was not a power to be trifled with. Their influence stretched across several star systems, their military forces were advanced beyond human capabilities, and their ruling family was as ruthless as they were revered. If Queen Tishara's enemies had kidnapped her daughter, then Zyra's presence here wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a ticking bomb. Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing the bridge of his nose. You know, I usually get some kind of warning before getting dragged into a political crisis. Zyra arched an eyebrow, her violet eyes steady. Would it have made a difference? He considered that for a moment. No, probably not. He had taken an oath to heal, and he had never been able to turn away someone in need, no matter how dangerous the circumstances. But this was something else entirely. A condition beyond normal medicine. Ethan knelt beside Zyra, activating the advanced scanner from his medkit, letting it hover just above her spine. The device hummed softly, its holographic display flickering with a complex web of nerve damage, scarred tissue, and disrupted energy pathways. Zelvari physiology was different from human biology, their nervous system heavily intertwined with bioelectrical currents that regulated their strength and agility. And yet, Zyra's injury was unlike anything he had ever seen. The damage to her spinal cord wasn't just physical. It was energetic, as if something had severed her connection to her own body, leaving her legs unresponsive, weakened beyond natural recovery. Ethan frowned. This wasn't a normal injury, was it? Zyra's gaze flickered. No. The younger Zelvari woman, her attendant, her protector, perhaps even her sister, shifted uncomfortably. Ethan glanced between them. Tell me what happened. Zyra hesitated. But then, with a sigh, she finally spoke. My captors used a device. Something we have never seen before. A weapon designed to disrupt the Zelvari nervous system, to sever the connection between body and mind. Ethan's stomach twisted. A weapon that could render a Zelvari, one of the most physically capable species in the galaxy, completely helpless? That was more than just a political move. That was a declaration of war. And it meant whoever had taken her wasn't just interested in ransom or leverage. They were testing something. Experimenting. Ethan exhaled, his fingers tightening around the scanner. If that's the case, then traditional medicine won't be enough. He could repair the damaged tissue, restore circulation, even regenerate some of the lost motor function. But if her bioelectrical pathways had been disrupted, then she would never regain full control of her body. Unless he did something far more dangerous. Something that would either heal her completely or destroy what little function she had left. A risk worth taking. Zyra watched him carefully, studying his expression as if she could read the calculations running through his mind. "You're thinking of something," she said quietly. Ethan hesitated. "There's a treatment, but it's untested. I've never used it on a Zelvari before." Her gaze didn't waver. "Explain it to me." Ethan sighed. "Neural reconstruction therapy. It's an experimental technique. Human scientists have been developing it to repair severe spinal damage by stimulating nerve regrowth through bioelectric pulses." The younger Zelvari woman frowned. "Your species is capable of this?" Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "In theory. The problem is, human nervous systems work differently than Zelvari physiology. If I apply the wrong frequency, your body might reject the process entirely. It could make things worse." Zyra didn't flinch. "And if you succeed?" Ethan met her eyes. "Then you walk again." A heavy silence stretched between them. Ethan expected fear, hesitation, resistance. Instead, Zyra's lips curled into a wry, knowing smile. "Then let's begin." The procedure. The following hours were spent in meticulous preparation. Ethan adjusted the bioelectric stimulators, programming them to Zelvari nerve frequencies, ensuring that every setting was calibrated as precisely as possible. Zyra lay on the operating table, her body still, her expression unreadable. Despite the uncertainty, the danger, the unknowns, she remained composed, her regal presence unshaken. Ethan, on the other hand, felt the weight of the risk pressing against him like a vice. If he failed, if he miscalculated, he wouldn't just cripple her further. He might kill her. He exhaled, steeling himself. Then, he activated the device. The first pulse of energy rippled through her nervous system, a sharp, almost electric sensation that made her body tense involuntarily. Ethan monitored the readings, watching as the damaged nerves reacted, hesitated, then slowly began to regenerate. For the next several hours, he worked tirelessly, guiding the process, stabilizing her vitals, ensuring that her body didn't reject the treatment. And then, finally, the moment of truth. Ethan powered down the device, stepping back, his heart pounding. "Zyra." His voice was steady, but there was a quiet intensity beneath it. "Try to move your leg." For a moment, nothing happened. Then the smallest twitch. Zyra's breath hitched. A spark of movement. A flicker of control. Ethan felt his chest tighten. It was working. Zyra's fingers curled into fists, her expression one of stubborn determination. She tried again. This time, her leg shifted. Her violet eyes widened. The younger Zelvari woman let out a soft gasp of disbelief. Ethan exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. She wasn't just healing. She was recovering. The Queen's arrival. Ethan barely had time to process the success of the treatment before alarms blared through the safe house. The young Zelvari woman, Zyra's attendant, who had remained quiet for most of the procedure, froze, then paled. "She's here." Ethan blinked. "Who's here?" The answer came not in words, but in the sudden presence of an entire Zelvari Royal Guard unit, descending into the safe house like shadows, weapons drawn, their movements impossibly fast. And at the center of them, standing with the unmistakable aura of power, authority, and lethal intent, Queen Tashara of the Zelvari Empire. Ethan felt his pulse spike. He had just healed her daughter, but he had no idea whether that made him a hero or a target. Chapter 3. The weight of a queen's favor. The tension in the air was thick enough to suffocate. Ethan had treated wounded men under fire, stitched up soldiers while plasma bolts burned holes through the walls around him, and pulled people back from the brink of death in places where no one should have been alive. but nothing compared to standing in the presence of an alien queen, surrounded by armed Zelvari warriors, uncertain whether he had just saved a princess or made himself the target of an interstellar execution. Queen Tashara stood perfectly still, her presence radiating an aura of absolute control. Her midnight blue skin shimmered under the dim lights, the glow of her silver eyes scanning the room as though every molecule of the space belonged to her. The Zelvari monarchs were known for their unshakable poise, and Tashara was no exception. Her gaze flicked to Zyra, still lying on the medical cot, then back to Ethan, assessing, calculating. Explain. One word. Sharp. Commanding. Not a request. A demand. Ethan forced himself to keep his breathing steady. She was paralyzed. Now she isn't. The Queen's expression didn't change, but he felt the shift in the atmosphere, the weight of a dozen Zelvari guards subtly adjusting their stance, as if ready to react at the first sign of a threat. Zyra, still weak but determined, pushed herself up on her elbows. The strain was evident, but the movement was real, a feat that had been impossible just hours ago. A murmur rippled through the gathered guards. One of them, a tall male with regal battle armor marking him as Tashara's highest-ranking general, took an involuntary step forward. Impossible. Tashara's eyes narrowed. You dare interfere with my daughter's condition? Ethan met her gaze, resisting the primal instinct to look away, to bow, to submit to a presence that commanded entire fleets. He had worked with warlords and politicians before, and he knew power when he saw it. But he was a doctor first, and if there was one thing he refused to do, it was apologize for saving a life. Interfere? No. I saved her. A breath of silence. Heavy. Sharp. Dangerous. Then, unexpectedly Zyra laughed. It was a small, breathless thing, but it was enough to break the crushing stillness in the room. Mother, if he wished me harm, he had every chance to kill me during the procedure. She exhaled, flexing her fingers, as though testing them for the first time. Instead, he did what no one else could. For the first time since her arrival, Tashara's expression faltered. It was only a flicker, a shift in the silver glow of her eyes, but it was enough for Ethan to see it. This wasn't just a show of dominance. This was a mother seeing her daughter move for the first time since she had been taken. A quiet, unspoken war raged behind her eyes. The queen, the ruler, the warrior, and the mother, the woman who had believed her child would never walk again. Ethan said nothing. He didn't have to. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Tashara turned to him once more, her voice steady but no longer edged with immediate threat. What did you do? Ethan inhaled, regaining his composure. Neural reconstruction therapy. It was risky, but I adjusted it to match Zelvari bioelectrical pathways and... He gestured to Zyra. Well, you can see the results for yourself. Tashara studied him for a long moment, then glanced at her daughter again. Can you walk? Zyra swallowed, then nodded. With visible effort, she shifted her legs off the cot, placing them onto the ground. For a brief second, she wavered, her body not yet fully accustomed to the movement. Ethan took an instinctive step forward, but Zyra lifted a hand to stop him. Then, slowly, she pushed herself upward. A collective breath was held in the room. The guards, the queen, even Ethan himself. Then she stood. It was shaky, unsteady, but she was standing. A hushed murmur spread through the guards. Some of them exchanged looks of disbelief, awe, uncertainty. Tashara's mask of control finally cracked, just slightly. And that was when Ethan realized something important. Zyra's recovery wasn't just personal. It was political. This changed everything. The burden of a life restored. The queen wasted no time. Within minutes, Ethan was escorted not as a prisoner, but not quite as a guest onto one of the Zelvari royal vessels. The safe house, the medical cot, the dusty streets of Rusthaven. All of it was left behind as he found himself in the heart of an empire he had never expected to set foot in. The Zelvari didn't operate like humans. They had no senators, no councils, no committees. Power belonged solely to the monarch and the warlords sworn to her. And now, he was in their hands. Ethan was led into a private chamber within the Queen's flagship, a grand room made of obsidian-like metal, illuminated by streaks of glowing silver energy flowing through the walls like veins of a living being. Tashara sat at the head of a long table, Zyra beside her. The younger Zelvari's skin had regained some of its vibrance, but she still moved carefully, testing the limits of her newfound control. Across from them, Ethan sat, flanked by two guards who looked ready to break him in half if he so much as breathed wrong. Tashara folded her hands. "You have done something extraordinary, human." Ethan exhaled. "I do that sometimes." A few of the guards tensed at his casual tone, but the queen merely tilted her head, observing him with that same cold, unreadable expression. "You saved my daughter," she continued, "and in doing so, you have changed the course of events that were long set in motion." Ethan frowned. "How so?" Zyra shifted, meeting his gaze. "If I had remained crippled, the warlords would have used it as a reason to question my right to succession." Ethan's stomach sank. Of course, Zyra was the heir, and an heir who was weak, incapable of leading in battle, would be challenged, cast aside. Her survival had not just been personal. It had been a matter of imperial stability. Tashara leaned forward slightly. "I owe you a debt, human." Ethan blinked. I didn't do it for payment." The queen's silver eyes gleamed. "And that is why you are worthy of receiving it." A subtle shift in the room. The guards stood a little straighter. Zyra herself looked surprised. Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Tashara exhaled slowly. "The Zelvari do not take life debts lightly. You saved the bloodline of my throne. That is not something I can ignore." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but the queen lifted a hand, silencing him. "You will be rewarded, whether you wish it or not." He had the sinking feeling that arguing was not an option. Zyra, smirking now, leaned toward him. "Congratulations, Ethan. You just became the most important human in the Zelvari Empire." And just like that, Ethan Voss realized he had walked into something far bigger than himself. Chapter 4. The Price of a Queen's Favor. The silence that followed Queen Tashara's decree was heavy, stretching between them like a gulf too vast to cross. The moment Ethan had been dreading since stepping into this world had finally arrived. He had become entangled in something far greater than a simple act of medical compassion. His oath as a doctor had always been simple: to heal, to protect, to save lives regardless of species, politics, or consequence. But now, that very act had placed him at the center of an empire's fate. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The Zelvari did not give rewards lightly, and they certainly did not grant them without expectation. He had read enough about their culture to understand that a life debt, especially from the ruling house, was an unbreakable contract. He had saved Princess Zyra's life, restoring her body when others believed it to be beyond healing. And now, in the eyes of the Zelvari Empire, he was owed something priceless in return. The problem was, he had no idea what that would mean. Ethan exhaled slowly, finally breaking the silence. "I appreciate the gratitude, Your Majesty, but I didn't do this for a reward." A murmur rippled through the assembled guards, some shifting in discomfort, others whispering among themselves as if Ethan had just spoken blasphemy. The Zelvari did not comprehend the concept of giving without expecting something in return. Their entire social structure was built upon honor, obligation, and reciprocation. Queen Tashara's expression remained unreadable, though a flicker of something amusement, perhaps curiosity, passed through her silver eyes. And yet, the debt remains. Zyra, sitting beside her mother, tilted her head slightly, watching him with that same calculating gaze that had been there from the start. She had been testing him since they met, probing his character, trying to understand what kind of man would risk so much for someone he did not know. Now, she finally spoke. "You are unfamiliar with our customs, Ethan, so let me explain. When a life debt is given by the royal bloodline, it is not merely a gesture of thanks. It is binding, permanent." Ethan frowned. "What exactly does that mean?" Zyra exchanged a glance with her mother before turning back to him. "It means you have a place in this empire now, a position of your choosing. Wealth, status, land, anything you desire." Ethan swallowed hard. This was getting worse by the second. Wealth? Power? He had never cared about those things. If he had, he wouldn't have left the core worlds to work in a struggling clinic on the edge of civilization. He shook his head. "I don't want any of that." Queen Tashara studied him for a moment, her gaze sharp. "Then what do you want, human?" Ethan opened his mouth, ready to refuse once more, but then he paused. He had spent his entire life healing people, helping where he could, but it had always felt like trying to stop a flood with his bare hands. The Outer Rim was filled with suffering, not just among humans but among dozens of alien species who were abandoned, discarded, ignored by the great powers of the galaxy. The Zelvari were among the most advanced civilizations known, with technology that could change the course of medicine forever. And yet, their focus had always been on war, expansion, dominance. What if, just this once, he could ask for something that truly mattered? Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady. Give me access to your medical technology. Let me use it to help those who can't afford to seek treatment in the core worlds. Let me open clinics where people human, Zelvari, and everyone else can be treated without worrying about politics or wealth. The request stunned the room into silence. Some of the guards looked as though they hadn't even considered such a thing before, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Zyra, however, merely smiled. Queen Tashara regarded him carefully, tapping a single clawed finger against the table. You ask not for wealth, nor for status, but for knowledge? Ethan nodded. Yes. A long pause. Then laughter. Not mocking, not cruel, but something deep, knowing, and oddly approving. Queen Tashara's lips curled into something resembling a smirk, the cold regality of her demeanor softening just slightly. Then you are a greater fool than I thought, Ethan Voss. She stood from her seat, her flowing robes trailing behind her like a dark wave of authority, and for the first time, she looked less like an untouchable ruler and more like a mother whose child had just been given back to her. Very well. Your request is granted. Ethan blinked. That was easier than expected. Too easy. He frowned. Just like that? Tashara arched a brow. Do you think I am in the habit of breaking my word? No, that wasn't it. Ethan had dealt with enough rulers, diplomats, and warlords to know that nothing was ever freely given. There was always a condition, a price, a catch. Zyra leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. There is, however, one thing you must understand. Ethan exhaled. There it was. What's the catch? Zyra smirked. You may not want wealth or status, but by accepting this debt, you are now under the protection of the royal house. That means you are no longer just an independent medic operating in the Outer Rim. Queen Tashara's silver eyes glowed softly, her voice carrying the weight of a decree that would be written into the annals of Zelvari history. From this day forward, Ethan Voss, you are a named ally of the Zelvari Empire. No force in the galaxy may harm you without invoking my wrath. The gravity of her words hit him like a collapsing star. This wasn't just some honorary title. She had just made him untouchable, which meant, I just became a political target, didn't I? Zyra chuckled. Oh, most definitely. Ethan groaned, rubbing his temples. Of course. Why not? A future changed forever. The following weeks were a whirlwind of negotiations, logistical planning, and an overwhelming number of security protocols. Ethan found himself escorted to Zelvari research facilities, granted access to healing technology that had been kept secret for centuries, and introduced to scientists, engineers, and physicians who regarded him with both curiosity and suspicion. More importantly, he was not alone in this endeavor. Zyra, now fully recovered and regaining her strength, had taken an interest in his mission, acting as his liaison to the Empire. And though neither of them would say it outright, there was something unspoken growing between them, something formed not out of duty or gratitude, but out of genuine understanding. One night, as they stood on the observation deck of a Zelvari starship, overlooking a planet where the first joint human-Zelvari medical facility was being established, Zyra spoke softly. You could have walked away, you know? Ethan smirked, leaning on the railing. Yeah, but where's the fun in that? Zyra laughed, shaking her head. You are reckless, Ethan Voss. He glanced at her, his smirk softening into something more genuine. Yeah, but I think that's why we get along so well. The stars stretched out before them, vast and endless. Ethan had come to the Outer Rim to save lives. He hadn't expected to change the course of a galactic empire. But sometimes, the universe had other plans. And Ethan Voss? He wasn't about to back down now.